an essay called Intimations of a New Worldview. It's easily the best thing I've read this year, if not in many years.
I'm making an argument for the existence of objective value. We experience meaning in life when we are subjectively attracted to something that's objectively attractive.
You hit all of the catnip words for me there, Brett.
Complexity is a precondition for the existence of anything, and life being the most complex phenomenon that there is.
A living, breathing thing that we are, in effect, creating as we go.
Complexity emerges at the border between order and chaos.
The sort of solution lies at the level of the individual, and that's where we need to be looking in the first instance.
What led to the greatest advancement in the scope of cooperation among civilizations was primarily war.
Admitting your mistakes, and that's going to require a lot of pain, and that's going to require a lot of humility and redirection. But following your heart is absolutely delightful.
Well, hello, everyone. It's Jim O'Shaughnessy with another edition of Infinite Loops. Today, something very different. As Monty Python would say, now for something completely different. Although really it isn't, because I did this with my friend Tom Morgan, who is a guest today, as well as Brett Andersen, who is an evolutionary psychologist PhD student at the University of New Mexico. You had me at evolutionary psychology, Brett. But what we're going to do today, also today, I have a co-host, my colleague and teammate at Infinite Loops, Ed William. Welcome, Ed, your first time on air. Okay, so today we're going to follow a similar format to what I did the last time I recorded with Tom. And we are going to turn the floor over to Tom and Brett to outline their thesis, which is going to take a while. It's a very, very interesting thesis, and thus their appearance here on Infinite Loops. And then we are going to pepper them with questions afterwards. So, Tom, throwing it over to you.
Thanks, Jim, and thanks for having me back again. Although, I'd like the focus today to be Brett. A couple of months ago, a good friend of mine, Sammy, sent me an article by Brett, an essay called Intimations of a New Worldview. I read it, and there's like 8 bullet points up top. And I read those 8 bullet points, and I was like, all right, I'm subscribing for the maximum tier of Brett Substack. This is like unbelievable. And I read the rest of it. It takes like 90 minutes. It's absolutely worth it. And it's completely blown me away. It's easily the best thing I've read this year, if not in many years. And the basic reason why is that the reason why my friend sent it to me is that there's all these ideas in there that I think are like monstrously important. But rather than just being the insane ramblings of some guy in his bedroom like me, it's actually incredibly well-founded and sourced in evolutionary psychology and complex adaptive systems and actual, quote unquote science, in that it seems like physics is catching up with a lot of indigenous wisdom. And there's a lot of other really fascinating kind of overlaps and agreements. And Brett just pulled them all together in this kind of unbelievable synthesis, something that I know you and I are both obsessed with. So I think, Brett's going to lay out that argument right now. And then we'll probably try and untie it afterwards with some thoughts. So Brett, floor's yours, mate.
Sure. Thank you for that very kind introduction, Tom, and thanks for having me, Jim. Yeah, so in this article, in this essay called Intimations of a New Worldview, one of the ways of thinking about what I'm doing, I don't really construe it this way in the essay, but one of the ways of thinking about what I'm doing is that I'm making an argument for the existence of objective value. And this is a problem because, moral philosophers have wrestled with this for a very long time, because there is this strange fact about human morality, which is that we construe morality and there's 2 reasons why objective values are important. The first one has to do with, what John Vervaeke calls the meaning crisis. Susan Wolf is a philosopher who wrote this very nice book called Meaning in Life. And what she argues in that book, and I think she's essentially correct about this, is that we experience meaning in life when we are subjectively attracted to something that's objectively attractive. And what she argues in that book is that modern people have a very hard time, or the idea of objective attractiveness is not viable to many modern people. The way that we used to construe things as being objectively attractive is potentially that they're objectively attractive because they are emanating from a transcendent world, and many of us don't believe in that kind of transcendent world anymore. But the other reason why objective values are important is because There was a very nice paper published in Behavioral and Brain Sciences in 2018 by a guy named Kyle Stanford. And what he pointed out is that we construe morality as objective. Even if we don't say that it's objective, we still think about it as objective. And so if you were to say, you like pistachio ice cream, and I were to say that I like chocolate ice cream, we can disagree about that without anybody being wrong, right? So that's a subjective preference. But if you were to say, you know what, I really like Hitler, I really think that Hitler was a good guy. Okay, well, I'm not going to treat that in the same way that I would treat your preference for ice cream, right? We treat those kinds of moral claims as if they're objective. We act as if somebody is objectively wrong if they say something off the wall like, murder is good, or we would act as if that person is objectively wrong. So moral philosophers have wrestled with this question, because where does that objectivity come from? It's certainly not clear. But I'm making the case here for objective value, but it's a little bit different than the case that's been made before. So I have these 8 points that I want to make, and I'll go through them relatively quickly. The first point that I make is that, so there's a recent book published by Bobby Azarian called The Romance of Reality. And in that book, he's making the case. It's a synthesis of about the last 30 years of advancements in complexity science, in the scientific study of complexity. Complexity is a very interesting phenomenon. So Lee Smollen's this physicist. He wrote this great book in 1997 called The Life of the Cosmos. And in that book, he had a discussion of complexity that I think is very, very interesting. He said that the newfound understanding of complexity in science was going to change the way that we understand the world, because in the old sort of Newtonian understanding of the world, life is an accident, right? Life is an accidental byproduct. But in the newfound understanding of complexity, our very understandings of space and time, our very understandings of where things are located in space and time, require a complex world. And so complexity cannot be a byproduct, right? Complexity is a precondition for the existence of anything, and life being the most complex phenomenon that there is. What Smolin argues is that this means that life and complexity are not byproducts, are not accidents. They were in some sense inevitable. What Bobby Azarian does is he takes, again, it's probably the last 25, 30 years of scientific study in this area, and shows how there is this process of complexification that is inevitable in some sense. It's a process by which, particles become atoms, atoms become molecules, molecules become stars, galaxies, life, and so on. And so from the beginning of the universe, we've seen this increase in complexity. And Bobby argues that this increase in complexity is in some sense inevitable. And there was a paper published in 2018 in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences that laid out the sort of contours of this process, like what the actual sort of pieces of this process are. One of the pieces is something called self-organized criticality. So that's a technical term. What it means is that complexity emerges at the border between order and chaos. So a crystal is like an ordered system, and a crystal is not complex, because if you know what one part of the system looks like, you know what the whole thing looks like. A gas is on the other end of the continuum. A gas is chaos, right? It's a chaotic system, but it's also not complex, because again, if you know what one part looks like, you know what the whole thing looks like. Complexity emerges at the border between order and chaos. The question, and Per Bach was the physicist who did a lot of this work. The question for Per Bach was, how do systems get to that narrow window between order and chaos in nature? How do they get there without any tuning from an outside agent? Because of course we can tune systems to that critical, but systems in nature have to get there all on their own. And so they self-organize. They self-organize from the bottom up. And so we refer to that as self-organized criticality. That's one piece of the puzzle in explaining the emergence of complexity in nature. What Uri Wolf and colleagues argue in this 2008 paper, or 2018 paper, is that there's another puzzle piece that has to be included in this in order to explain the emergence of hierarchical complexity, which is the fact that different patterns emerge at different levels of analysis. And what they argue that this other piece is competing interactions. So at all levels of analysis, what they argue is that there are competing interactions, and those competing interactions create tension, and that tension leads to self-organized criticality, which is, it manifests as these avalanche events. But that tension leads to self-organized criticality and complexity. So I'll give a couple examples of that. And they argue that this is true in biology, but it's also true in the pre-biological world as well. So long distance versus short distance interactions in a molecular structure can lead to this kind of tension. Competing interactions between the interests of individuals and the interests of the group that they're embedded in, competing interactions between the interests of males and females of a species, that's sexual selection, competing interactions between parasites and hosts. All of these things can lead to complexification, both in the physical world, the pre-biological world, and in the biological world. So that's basically point one, right? So I argue that there's a process of complexification, and I sort of outline what the contours of this process look like. The second point is that this process of complexification manifests in biology. So there's a couple of books that were written about this in the year 2000. They were both published in 2000. One is John Stewart's book called Evolution's Arrow. So he argues that there's a direction to evolution. That direction is in the direction of increasing complexity. Robert Wright wrote a book called Non-Zero, and he also argues that in cultural evolution, there's a direction towards increasing complexity. And what Robert Wright really makes clear in that book, and it winds up very nicely with what Uri Wolf and colleagues were doing in the 2018 paper. What Robert Wright makes clear in his book Non-Zero is that it's competition that has led to cultural complexification. So especially competition between groups leads to increased cooperation within groups, because more cooperative groups tend to win in the competitive landscape. But also competition between people within groups leads to specialization. And so that competition leads to both integration and differentiation. And that's actually the definition of complexity. So the definition of complexity, that there's multiple definitions floating around, but one definition that has been used across multiple literatures is that a more complex system is both highly differentiated and highly integrated. And so we see that this process of competing interactions leading to self-organized criticality, leading to complexification, manifests in biology, and it manifests in cultural evolution as well. So that's basically point two. Point three is that we have been selected for our participation in this process of complexification. So a couple of people point to make this case. So Jeffrey Miller wrote a book in 2000 as well called The Mating Mind, and he argued in that book that there's this problem in human biology, which is trying to understand why we have such big brains, right? So human beings, for our body size, we have huge brains. We have brains that are extremely, convoluted, extremely complex and large brains. And the question is, and these are very costly because they're calorically costly, but they're also developmentally costly. And so the question is, why did we evolve these big brains, right? And why did we evolve them so rapidly? Because it only took maybe 2.5 million years, which sounds like a long time, but in evolutionary terms, it's pretty quick. What Jeffrey Miller argued is that this was very likely to be due to runaway sexual selection. So one of the ways you can get rapid evolutionary change is that you can get this feedback loop caused by sexual selection, where you see this in, for example, birds, right? So like peacocks, the preference in females for the tail of the male peacock becomes genetically correlated with the genes that promote the tail in the male peacock. Okay, when that correlation happens, you end up getting this rapid positive feedback loop where you can get massive evolutionary change in a very short time. And Jeffrey argues, and I think somewhat convincingly, that was likely the case for human encephalization, but it doesn't tell the whole story, because one of the things that it doesn't explain is why there isn't a large sex difference in brain size, which you normally get with sexual selection, and it also probably wouldn't have taken the process of runaway sexual selection would probably be faster, actually, than 2.5 million years. That's what Jeffrey argued anyways. A more recent paper came out which argued that yes, sexual selection played a role, but they also explained why we don't see this sex difference, and also it makes it clear why we were selected for our participation in this process of complexification. So this was Ed Hagen and Zachary Garfield in a 2019, I believe it's still a preprint. And what they argue, so first off, they point out that leaders have increased reproductive success. So especially like male leaders have increased reproductive success. And this poses an evolutionary problem because reproductive success is a zero-sum game. So if one man succeeds in terms of reproductive success, that's success that comes at the cost of the success of every other man in that group. And so the question is, why in the world would men select somebody for leadership if that person is going to have greater success that comes at the cost of their success, right? This poses an evolutionary puzzle. What they argue is that leaders provide benefits to the group. So what they do is they solve problems in such a way that it benefits themselves at the same time as it benefits everybody else in the group. So they call this joint utility improvement. Really what that is the discovery and facilitation of non-zero-sum games. I left out something. So going back to point 2, I actually left out the fact that in biology and in cultural evolution, the process of complexification manifests as an increase in the scope of non-zero-sum games over time. So over cultural evolution, we see these larger and larger civilizations, which become more integrated and more differentiated through specialization over time. And what Robert Wright argued in Non-Zero is that's just the increase in the scope of non-zero-sum games. You see the same thing in biology, where you go from single-celled organisms to multicellular organisms. What this idea from Ed Hagen and Zachary Garfield suggests is that we were selected based on our propensity to discover and facilitate non-zero-sum games. And women were selected based on their propensity to do this in the context of motherhood and the family. That's what they argue, that motherhood represents the sort of paradigm of this kind of leadership that they're arguing for. And so it sort of solves the problem of why there wasn't a sex difference. And what they argue is that this capacity to discover and facilitate non-zero-sum games largely involves the ability to solve combinatorially explosive problems. Because when you're solving a problem just for yourself, it can sometimes be relatively simple. But if you have to solve a problem such that it's good for you, it's good for your family, it's good for your reciprocal relationships, and it's good for the group at large, and it's good for all those things at the same time, this can quickly become combinatorially explosive. So a combinatorially explosive problem is one where there's a potentially infinite number of solutions, only a few of which are optimal or close to optimal. And generally speaking, there's not an algorithm for solving these problems. So how is it that we solve these kinds of problems? And that brings us to point 4, which is that our ability to solve combinatorially explosive problems relies on our ability to realize relevance. So John Vervaeke, who is somebody who has massively influenced me, has this YouTube this YouTube series called Awakening from the Meaning Crisis. And one of John's sort of main shticks in that series and in his academic work is relevance realization. And John and I have published on this subject. Relevance realization, John calls it the criterion of the cognitive. Relevance realization refers to this fact that within cognitive science, there are a family of problems, and they can all be reduced to the problem of how is it that with the infinite complexity of the world around us, how is it that we intelligently ignore all of the irrelevant inputs and zero in on only those things that are relevant to us? And this also goes for things like our own long-term memory, right? Because we have a huge number of things in our long-term memory. How is it that we zero in on the relevant aspects of that? And John has a theory of relevance realization, a theory of a process, the process by which we realize relevance. And so what my argument is, to connect this to the third point, is that and what he argues is that our ability to solve combinatorially explosive problems relies on our ability to realize relevance. And what's so interesting about this in the context of this essay is that the process that John describes as relevance realization is the same as the process of complexification described by Uri Wolf and colleagues. And it's really uncanny. The overlap between them is really uncanny because they talk about it in terms of competing interactions that lead to self-organized criticality that leads to an increase in integration. Okay, well, for John, he doesn't use the term competing interaction. He uses the term opponent processing. So there's an opponent processing relationship between the pursuit of efficiency on the one hand and the pursuit of resiliency on the other. And he argues that it's the tension caused by this opponent processing that tension leads, and he explicitly refers to self-organized criticality. It leads to self-organized criticality in the brain, which leads to increased complexification over time. And so that process that we've been selected for participating in, which is relevance realization, is the process of complexification. So that's point 4. Point 5 relates this to the work of Jordan Peterson. So Jordan Peterson wrote this book in 1999 called Maps of Meaning. And whatever you may think about Jordan these days, he's a little bit abrasive on Twitter, let's say. But whatever you may think about him these days, he spent a lot of time on that book, and the lectures that go along with that book are really, really great, and they were really helpful to me. But in that book, he argues. In that book, he lays out a process, and he lays out this pattern that he calls the metamythology. It's a process. And what I argued in this essay and in a previous essay is that pattern that he lays out, that he calls the metamythology, is relevance realization, right? It is the same pattern as relevance realization. So what are the overlaps? Well, one of the overlaps is that it occurs at the border between order and chaos. It involves this descent into chaos, and within relevance realization, that descent into chaos manifests as an insight. An insight is the way that we break the way that we're framing the world in order to frame the world in a new way so that we can better solve combinatorially explosive problems. The metamythology involves the same pattern as an insight. So it involves an initial period of stability, an anomaly that disrupts that stability, a descent into chaos, and a reemergence into a higher order. And that's a process that occurs at the border between order and chaos. And it's represented mythologically as the hero figure. So what he argues in that book, is that mythological narratives have a general structure. And of course, Jordan isn't the first person to argue this. Carl Jung made this argument. Joseph Campbell made this argument. Mythological narratives have a general structure, which Campbell called the monomyth, and which Jordan calls the metamythology. But that general structure is what I just described, right? Order, descent into chaos, reemergence into a higher order. So how is it that disparate cultures could arrive at a general structure within their mythological narratives? And what Jordan argues is that over the course of human evolution, we have observed individuals who have engaged in heroic behavior. We have observed individuals who have achieved great things, let's say, and we tell stories about them. And we have all of these stories about these particular individuals engaging in whatever it may be, whether they're a great hunter or an innovator or a leader. And what we do, so we love to tell stories. There was a study that showed that like 80% of nighttime talk among this hunter-gatherer group was storytelling. But we also love to engage in abstraction. We generalize. And so what we've done is we've attempted to find the general pattern underlying these particular narratives, sort of like the line of best fit, a pattern that conveys the wisdom that's inherent to all of these particular stories. And we tell that, and it's a fiction, right? But it's not a fiction in terms of being untrue, right? It's a fiction in terms of conveying the general pattern underlying many particular narratives. Eric Hole argues that, Eric Hole and Jordan Peterson have both said that these fictions are, in some sense, they're more real than real, right? Because there's a generalized. Sorry about that. So they're more real than real because they have a general ability that's not inherent to any. I'll find my place here in just a second. So in this story, the point is that that pattern lines up very nicely with relevance realization. It's the same pattern as relevance realization. So we love to tell stories, right? And we also love to engage in abstraction. And so what we do is we've told all of these stories about particular people doing particular things, but then we abstract out the general pattern underlying these heroic behaviors, and we tell that as a story, and it's a fiction, but it's not a fiction in terms of being untrue. Right. So Eric Hole is this neuroscientist who has made a very similar argument to Jordan Peterson in some ways, but he argues that these fictions are more real than real because they convey a generalizability that's not inherent to any of the particular narratives. And so that's basically point 5, right? We told our mythological narratives are conveying this pattern, right? Conveying this pattern of relevance realization, which is this also this process of complexification. Point 6, I argue that our participation in this process is optimal. It's optimal because so this process is the same thing as self-organized criticality. The argument has been made. So self-organized criticality, that concept originated in statistical physics, but it's become an important concept in biology and neuroscience. In biology, the theoretical case has been made that biological systems function optimally at criticality, meaning that they function optimally at the border between order and chaos. This is true, and there are also empirical studies which have found that systems in nature are actually functioning at or near criticality. This is true of things like genetic regulatory systems, flocks of birds, and most importantly for our purposes, the brain. And that's why this concept has become important in neuroscience, because criticality has all these very strange properties that make it very interesting in terms of analyzing the brain in terms of self-organized criticality. So one argument that's been made is that the brain functions optimally at criticality. Another very interesting argument that's been made is that consciousness emerges at criticality in the brain. So what sedatives do is they take you out of criticality by increasing order in the brain. And it's been argued that the reason why sedatives work is because consciousness emerges at criticality, and by tilting you towards too much order, so they take you out of criticality and therefore take you out of consciousness. Interestingly enough, psychedelics increase entropy in the brain, which is essentially chaos, and they actually it's been argued that they actually move you slightly closer to true criticality. But the point being that this process that occurs at the border between order and chaos, it involves this descent into chaos and reemergence. It's the process of relevance realization, right? That process represents the optimal pattern of behavior, biologically and psychologically. So psychologically, there is a nice paper written by my collaborator, Mark Miller, published earlier this year, where he's looking at well-being. He's looking at psychological well-being from a predictive processing perspective. Predictive processing is this emerging framework within cognitive science. And basically what he argues in that paper is that there's all sorts of indicators that psychological well-being emerges at the border between order and chaos. And that this process, so he uses some technical terms to describe it. He describes it in terms of destroying your own fixed point detractors. Just another way of saying breaking frame, really, involving these sorts of descents into chaos. That process is necessary for psychological well-being. So it's both biologically and psychologically optimal. So that's point 6. Point 7 is that our participation in this process, not only is it optimal, it represents our participation in the process of creation itself. So in point 1, I talked about Bobby Azarian's book, which argued that this process of complexification underlies the emergence of novelty in nature. It underlies the emergence of new phenomenon. And so our participation in this process represents our participation in that process, the process by which novelty emerges in nature, the process of creation itself. And then point 8 is probably the strangest and craziest point that I make. So there's a nice paper published this year, or to be published soon this year, in Human Nature, again by Ed Hagen, where Hagen and Aaron Leitner is the other person on that paper. They argue that it's a new theory about supernatural beliefs. And in the old sort of understanding, especially among cognitive scientists, supernatural beliefs are generally construed as being essentially bullshit, that the task is to understand how it is that we could believe this bullshit, basically was the task. What they're arguing is that this is not the case, that actually supernatural beliefs are a cognitive strategy that we use to get a grip on the world. We personify things. Part of the reason we do this is because human beings, especially among primates, we're intensely social creatures, right? So what an analogy is, right? An analogy is just using a familiar pattern to get a grip on a novel pattern, right? Well, social patterns are extremely familiar to us, and we use those kinds of social patterns to get a grip on novel, complex patterns. What they argue is that complex systems are especially useful to personify complex systems, because you can think about complex systems in terms of intentionality. And so I'll give an example of this, and complex phenomena in general. An example of this, which Jordan Peterson argued for in his series on the biblical lectures. And I don't know if this is true, but I think it's a nice example of how this could work. He argues that the God of the Old Testament was really a personification of the future, because we were discovering this idea of sacrifice, of sacrificing something in the present to get something in the future. And the God of the Old Testament is a harsh judge. The God of the Old Testament is a harsh judge who demands sacrifice. And that is what the future is like, right? Unless you make the proper sacrifices in the present, the future will judge you harshly. And so perhaps it's the case that as we're getting a grip on this idea of sacrificing something in the present for the future, it's very useful for us to personify this concept. Now, what I argue is that this process of complexification that I'm talking about, it's been personified in terms of these hero figures, right? So Marduk in Babylon, Horus in Egypt, Jesus Christ in our own culture, the Buddha. These are all personifications of this process of complexification. We have called that process, we've called those hero figures God, right? Well, it's interesting to me because that conception of God is actually almost identical to the conception of God put forward by a guy named Alfred North Whitehead, the philosopher who I really enjoy. He's known as the sort of founder of process philosophy in the 20th century. But Alfred North Whitehead essentially argued that God is a creative process that permeates nature that we can participate in. Now, he came to that conclusion from a somewhat different line of thought than I'm coming at it from, but the overlap is really uncanny. But it's also the same conception of God that was put forward by Jordan Peterson, both in Maps of Meaning, somewhat implicitly in Maps of Meaning, but he made it very explicit in this conversation that he had with, I think it was like Dave Rubin. And so this conception of God is not original to me, but this argument that I made here seems to make it extremely viable, or at least it's made it somewhat viable to me as a sort of scientifically, and for I ground my worldview in the scientific enterprise to some degree, and then at the end of the essay I sort of argue that this worldview that I put forward here can potentially be used as a response to the meaning crisis. So John Vervaeke wrote a book called Zombies, and I think it was called Zombies in Western Culture. And in that book, he puts forward these three orders that were lost when we lost our ability to believe, at least in the way that we once did, in the sort of Christian Aristotelian worldview. He calls these the nomological order, the narrative order, and the normative order. And the nomological order is basically the connection that exists between the mind and reality. Now, in the sort of Christian Aristotelian worldview, this was a teleological connection because Aristotle, of course, construed the world in terms of teleology, right? The rock falls to the earth because it wants to, to meet the earth, or however he talked about it. But of course, our mind is teleological as well, and so there was that connection. But we lost that connection. The connection here is that, well, relevance realization is the process by which cognitive development occurs, right? Relevance realization is the general process by which the mind works. And that process is the same as the process by which novelty emerges in nature. And so there's this deep continuity between the process of complexification in nature and the process of complexification in our own mind. And that's a kind of nomological order. The narrative order involves a participation, or at least in the Christian worldview, it involved a participation in the process by which the kingdom of God would be built on earth, is basically what it was. In this worldview that I put forward, there is a kind of narrative order. It's a little different than that, I think, but it's participating in the process of creation itself, right? Which isn't, it doesn't result in some sort of final utopia, but it's an ongoing, the process itself is the goal, right? Participating in the process itself is the goal. It's not like there's some final utopia that's the end goal. And it's because, participating in that process is, well, it's optimal, but it's as far as I'm concerned, it's almost equivalent to living a good life. And then the normative order requires a connection between ontology and a connection between ontology and values. So a connection between what is really real and what is valuable. And in the Christian worldview, of course, what was really real is, God is emanating values to us, right? We have values because they were given to us essentially by a transcendent God. But in this worldview, it's somewhat different because what's really real is this process of complexification. It's the grounding of what's real. And it also represents the existence of objective value, because our participation in this process is optimal, and that optimality is supported by mainstream scientific findings. And what I want to make clear here is that, with the exception of some of the obvious ones, like whether this is participating in creation, all this stuff that I'm citing here is mainstream science, right? These are papers published in Human Nature and so on. So this is not, I'm not relying on fringe science. But yeah, that's basically it. So it's a connection between all these 8 points, and I argue that this can be a response to the meaning crisis.
Yeah, I think that's amazing, Brett. And I don't expect that to be easy for people straight off the bat. There's so many ideas, and what I find interesting is that there's so much agreement between what are relatively disparate parts. Having sat on it for a couple of months, I'll maybe tell you what's come out of it for me in terms of like landing the plane, and then maybe Jim would like to jump in. But it's like, all right, I think Jim and I are both kind of closet Taoists, and there's a flow of things. There's a line in Bobby Azarian's book that you tipped me onto, Romance of Reality, which is the goal of any species is to become statistically correlated with its environment, which doesn't sound very romantic, but basically it just means getting the maximum amount of bang for your buck, right? Moving through the world as efficiently as possible. And I always think of the example of the Taoist sage who clicks his fingers and creates a thunderstorm, right? You're getting the most amount of egoic action for the least amount of exploration, as it were, and that your opponent processing is perfect, right? How do you actually do that? What does this mean for our lives? I think you've nailed it with the positive sum games, that you basically are attracted to playing some sort of positive sum game in your own life, because it feels intrinsically meaningful and fun and joyful, and you love it, and it pulls you down into a niche while also making you more integrated into the whole system. And that's also tied into relevance realization, which appears to me to be kind of functionally equivalent to wisdom. And wisdom, it turns out, correlates with happiness, flourishing, like your well-being in life, your psychological well-being, kind of everything. And whilst I think it's going to be difficult to necessarily pull this all together, it's fascinating to me that all of these different factors seem to correlate with like real life flourishing, despite them being relatively abstract concepts. I think that's all kind of I had to say, but maybe Jim wants to jump in, or Brett.
So I will jump in. Like you hit all of the catnip words for me there, Brett. Just a few observations and then a question. If you read the early quantum physicists, and in their non-physics writing, all of them, or mostly all of them, I'm thinking of David Bohm, I'm thinking of Schrodinger, I'm thinking of all of that early crew. They wrote things that were very, very similar to your thesis, right? The whole idea, they started to see the world, the universe, as a participatory thing, right? Not as, in the Newtonian sense, a machine. No, quite far away from that. It was exactly in their writings that I've read and that is consistent with the quantum physics that they're finding, is no, it's actually a living, breathing thing that we are in effect creating as we go. And so I find that absolutely fascinating. And then on consciousness, there is some speculation right now, again, mostly from physicists, that consciousness might involve or be explainable through the idea of quantum entanglement, where we as a species, other species as well, are entangled in some way that we can't describe right now, because it needs to violate things being able to move faster than the speed of light. And so if we have information A here and a million light years away, information B here, experimental or experimenting on this has proven that you change this right here at A, instantly changes B. So that's a quandary, because that means that either Einstein is wrong and that light does not travel at a constant, or it means that there is something happening at the quantum level where these two things change instantaneously because they're connected. And so that loop of connection allows for changing something here, and then a million light years away it changes here. So that's just more of a comment than anything else. I'd like your insights into that. But the second one, to go back to the more pedestrian but very important idea of competition leading to positive sum cooperation. I fully subscribe to that, right? Like if you look at what I'm doing right now with a new company, it's all based on positive sum games. And I think that we are at an inflection point in society. And I have said often that I personally believe the Prometheans are among us, and they are going to be bringing lots of changes to the world. So I guess to put it in the form of a question, what do you think about this idea of quantum entanglement? I'm fascinated, by the way, about sedatives leading to you turning off consciousness. That's another hint, I think, right? That there's obviously some involvement there, and especially psychedelics opening the aperture of our brain and seeing a world that is very, very different than the naive realism would suggest. So let's first get your thoughts on quantum entanglement, and then shift it over to a more practical, if competition between groups leads to more cooperation, and then competition within the in-group leads to specialization, how do we practically take advantage of that to get us to better outcomes?
Yeah. So in terms of quantum entanglement, or what are my thoughts on? I don't really have any thoughts on quantum entanglement, mostly because I don't may have any illusions about understanding it. What's so interesting to me is that Alfred North Whitehead, whose philosophy I highly resonate with, and I think it's very consistent with a lot of the arguments that I'm making. Whitehead was motivated. So Whitehead was somebody who did understand the mathematics of quantum theory. And he was a very unique character in the sense that he was a mathematical genius. So he wrote this book with Bertrand Russell called the Principia Mathematica, sort of broke math essentially. But he was also somebody who was educated in a way that basically nobody's educated anymore. He had read the entire Western canon, essentially, all of the major Western philosophers. And so what he realized was that quantum theory and general relativity and special relativity broke Western philosophy, right? The assumptions that were inherent in Western philosophy were essentially broken by quantum mechanics. And so what he argued is that this would require a shift in our ontology from what had been essentially mainstream metaphysics, mainstream ontology since Plato, which was a substance ontology, the idea that what is really real are things, right? Substances, particles, whatever you want to, however you want to say that. What he argued is that no. What's really real at bottom is our processes and the relations between processes. He called it a process relational ontology. And this was apparent to him because of quantum theory. Now, other people have said the same thing. So that, despite the fact that I don't understand quantum theory, I don't understand the math at all. But there have been papers written recently, a paper published in Nature recently that said, and it was this physicist who said, we have got to learn to stop thinking in terms of things, right? Things are not real in the way that we think that they are. What's real are processes. And interestingly enough, Ian McGilchrist, who I know has affected Tom's thought a lot, makes this argument in his newest book, and to some degree in his first book, The Master and His Emissary, and argues that process thinking is right hemisphere thinking, really, and I think that's largely correct. So yeah, in terms of the relationship between that and consciousness, I don't know. I suspect there's some relationship there. Now, the theory of consciousness that I personally think is the most plausible at the moment is integrated information theory, in terms of the theories about the nature of consciousness. So when we're talking about consciousness, really there's two questions There's the question of what's it good for, right? So like the function, what is it doing for us, if anything? But then there's the question about the nature of it. And the question about the nature of it is a problem for us because of this substance ontology that we have that's really implicit in our thinking. Because for many people, what's really real are things that you can knock on them. You can they sort of have this billiard ball causality. Well, consciousness is clearly not like that, right? It has this internal quality, and philosophers have wrung their hands about this for at least the last since Descartes, at least, and so this is a real problem for us. Integrated information theory, part of the reason why I'm attracted to it is because it's so concordant with everything that I've written here. Because what integrated information theory says that what consciousness is essentially complexity. It's a particular kind of complexity. It's not all complexity, right? Because a civilization might be extremely complex, but a civilization is not conscious as a whole, right? A person is. It's a particular kind of integration that occurs, and the more differentiated an entity is that can be integrated in this way, the more conscious it is. And so it would attribute consciousness to a slug or a bee or whatever, but not as much consciousness as we have, right? So the intensity of the experience is greater in us. But anyway, in the relationship between that and quantum mechanics, who knows? I suspect there is a relationship there, but it's hard to say what it is. And then,
and then, thank you. And then just the more practical side here of competition between groups leads to more cooperation, not less. And then within the in-group, competition there leads to specialization. This is also super, as you were talking, I'm sure you probably have read many of these books, but The Weirdest People in the World covers this quite extensively about cultural evolution as opposed to mama nature evolution, and is quite compelling in many of the respects and seems to be supportive of what you are saying. A book that you probably haven't read that I'm recommending a lot now is The Genius of the Beast by Howard Bloom. It talks about markets, free markets, being work better than any other solution because they essentially are based on the very biology of nature. And his main lament in the book is that we have removed emotion from our study of markets that we get a lot of bad output from the econometric models that are based purely on abstraction. Now, I'm a huge fan of abstraction because we didn't have it, we would have no quantum physics. Claude Shannon wouldn't have had anything to write about. But the interesting for me was his development of this idea of, so-called demand, to use all of the economic terms, supply and demand. Demand is a human emotion. It is generated from a human desire. And he advocates in the book, which came to convince me that he's right, is you need to understand that markets are us, they're human beings. And that, you mentioned bees. Bees are quite sophisticated if you go through studying bees, which is something I've done, which is really interesting. Like the mathematics of the dance of the bee to show the other bees where the nectar requires advanced calculus, right? And then I love that some bees get unemployed and basically just hang around the hive to look for new employment. My point being that these seemingly disparate things, right? Bees, ants, termites, actually, when you study them, the underlying process that we're looking at is very similar to the underlying process to human markets, to human societies, to all of these things. So I very much buy the idea that there's something else going on here, and the need to get a better handle on it is there. I tend to go back to, okay, so Wittgenstein, don't look for meaning, look for use. Like, so I'm trying to figure out, okay, let's stipulate that many of your 8 points are correct. Where does that lead us as people who want to help other people understand, if you change this about the way you looked at the world, or if you change this about the way you felt about something, your outcomes might improve dramatically.
And I think, Jim, just to jump in very quickly there, to sort of contribute to that question, is that one thing that sort of interests me is the idea that in both Brett's and Tom's writing is that the sort of solution lies at the level of the individual, and that's where we need to be looking in the first instance. And I suppose some of what you both write about the ideas of needing to sort of minimize, to sort of look for positive sum games and to sort of find the right competitive environments and the right cooperative environments. To me, that suggests that there's a certain need for a level of, political and economic decision-making and some top-down cultivation of the environment. And that doesn't seem to be something that either of you write about that much. And it sort of ties into Jim's question as to what the practical implications of what you're writing about are.
Okay, so there's a few things there, and I'll try to go through them in order. So, Jim, one of the first things you talked about was this process of cultural evolution and how competition between groups leads to cooperation within groups. Now, there's something very interesting about this because we are at the end of the road when it comes to that. We shouldn't be romantic about this, right? What led to this great advancement in the scope of cooperation among civilizations was primarily war. And we're at the end of that road, right? We can't go to war with each other anymore. We don't want to. We can't do it. We have nuclear weapons. If we do that, we're all dead. So the question is, what happens now? And my answer is, I don't know what happens now, but we have to find a way, to create a non-zero sum game that is going to preclude us from going to nuclear war with each other, but also that's we're not just going to fractionate into our little tribes or something. I don't know what the future holds there, but this sort of leads me, and I'll skip the part of that about the individual. So, it leads me to the point that Ed made, which is that the focus on the individual. And I do think that this is the only viable solution, which is, we're having some real problems in the Western world at the moment with, in my own sort of sphere of academia, as far as I'm concerned, there is a real pathology within academia, this ideology that has essentially taken over academia. And I'm very worried about it because I do believe that the universities are and have been at the heart of Western civilization, and they've been sort of infected by this thing. And so the question is, what do we do about it? And for me, the answer is I don't like naming names here, but I don't want to do what James Lindsay does, right? So what James Lindsay does is essentially, call names and sort of go down that road. I think that all that's going to lead to sort of this intense moral polarization. To my mind, the solution to that problem and the solution to other problems is facilitating this process in as many individuals as possible, facilitating the process by which you become a powerful, competent, forthright individual who's capable of saying what you actually believe in the face of people who will punish you for those beliefs, right? Like that's how that's the solution to that kind of problem. But I think it's like a meta solution, right? Because competent groups come from the interactions of competent and forthright individuals, and so facilitating that process in individuals is like a meta solution. And I've argued that that's John Vervaeke in his Meaning Crisis series talks about agape. To my mind, that's what agape is. Agape is another word for love, but it's not romantic love, right? It's the kind of love that a parent has for their child. What you want for your child is for your child to become a powerful and competent and forthright individual, right? Well, the facilitation of that process in other people is agape, as far as I'm concerned. Now, you also talked about how these patterns manifest at different levels of analysis. So you talked about like bees and ants and all this, and there are similar patterns that manifest. I just read a very interesting book about this called Life Finds a Way, where they were arguing that patterns associated with creativity manifest at every level of analysis. And the reason why is because, and this has to do with relevance realization and the solving of combinatorially explosive problems, but it's true of biology too, and of evolutionary evolution of the evolutionary process. What they're basically arguing in that book is that chaos is necessary for creativity, right? A certain amount of chaos, because what happens is that you get stuck in these attractors, which are basically ruts, right? You get stuck in a solution to a problem, but it's not the optimal solution, right? There's another optimal solution that may be over here, a deeper attractor. What you have to do is you have to inject chaos into the system in order to escape from this shallow attractor, and then maybe you can find the deeper attractor. Well, that's what an insight is. It's also why psychedelics can induce insights in people. Now, I'm not a, I don't think psychedelics are an unerring good, but they've clearly shown their potential for facilitating transformations in people. And the way that they do this, it seems, is by essentially injecting noise and allowing you to escape. Is why, for example, they are the single best pharmaceutical intervention for smoking that's ever been done. And the reason why is because they help you to escape these ruts. But that same principle applies, for example, in artificial intelligence systems that are trying to find the best route for logistics in terms of routing, like shipping, trucks that are shipping. The best route for routing, like 10,000 trucks at a time. Well, and that's a ridiculously combinatorially explosive problem. And the way that the algorithms attempt to solve this problem is essentially they explore a landscape of solutions. They get stuck in these attractors. You have to inject noise, and then they potentially find a deeper attractor. And so, yeah, we do see these same patterns play out at every level of an analysis. And it's very interesting that they do, and to my mind, but it is this process that we can also participate in as individuals.
Well, I actually think that's sort of an answer, Ed. Sorry, Jim, which is that something I wrote about last week was that what does the king do in an archetypal fashion? Is he basically creates a container for other people to explore their own infinite game. He is effectively a patron, like the Medicis, that is like, I'm going to make everyone safe enough, like the hero, like the positive sum leader, that you can all do you in a way that makes you both integrated and, more individualized. And whilst I think that's kind of a fluffy answer for cool, what do we do next? I think that's one way to look for solutions in terms of breaking people out of these very rugged fitness landscapes. Sorry, Jim.
Yeah, no, you actually picked up on what I was going to say, which is, again, we're back to myths now. And Tom mentioned earlier, I'm not a pretend Taoist. I mean, if you forced me, I would say, and they said, you must list your religion, even though I don't have one, I would list Taoism to really fuck with their minds. But so these are everywhere. To get back to Brett's point, and you brought up two things that are near and dear to my heart: psychedelics. I think that I personally am supporting all of the movement to experiment with psychedelics. It's not only smoking, Brett. It is post-traumatic stress disorder. It is the addiction to opioids. I'm financing, or not just me, I'm participating in financing two documentaries that are being made on this, and like watching bits of the raw film is just like unbelievable. There's a woman who had been addicted to opioids for 12 years and literally 3 psilocybin guided. Now, let's be very clear. This is not her buying mushrooms from someone on the street. This is her working in a supervised, guided environment with a doctor present and a specialist in, I guess we'd call him the shaman, present, but completely free of her opioid addiction. So there is obviously something very deep going on there. But then AI. So I've always been interested in AI, and then I took the plunge and made an investment in Stability AI, of which I am the executive chair of the board. And one of our goals is actually to study all of the world's myths and put them into the AI to see what it makes of it. And we are attempting to have AI also programmed in all the known languages of the world. And I've made actually the assertion that wouldn't it be cool if we could at least get them to do Latin and ancient Greek and all of those things? Because if you study mythology, you study these stories, you see the origination point is often, eons ago. So that's a work in progress. And really what the argument is that our Shannon limits as human beings are limited, right? Whereas an AI can look at arrays of 10 million, 100 million combinations. And what that unlocks is access to the liminal spaces that are unseen by we humans. And we think that we're going to find a lot of information there as we aggregate all of the world's myths as far back as we can get them in machine readable format. So I'm super excited about what that outcome might be, because I think we're going to find a lot of similarities to what you've outlined. And, why did ancient humans have prohibitions? So, for example, intermarrying within closely genetically related people. Why did the Christian church, there was no science that said, interbreeding with close genetic people leads to really bad outcomes. And yet, what was the first thing that when the Christian church took over, it was, we're going to break up the clans. So in a way, early Christian doctrine created the Western world because it moved society away from its clannish behavior. But what was also interesting was their prohibition, just outright prohibition. It got to the point where they were saying you couldn't even marry your third cousin, right? So that was brought back. But that was all the early Christian church with no scientific data backing up that. And then if you read about other early taboos, what you find is that many of them occurred centuries before the scientific evidence said, oh, that's right. I'd love a response to that insight because I find that fascinating.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is cultural evolution, as in terms of the particular instance with Christianity and the outlawing of cousin marriages. I mean, I think that's an interesting one because that didn't necessarily, at least my understanding of it, is that in particular didn't necessarily evolve. Now, what did happen was it made the Christian, it made the group under the auspices of the Catholic Church way more powerful than it otherwise would be, and way more united than it otherwise would be. So, in that sense, there was an evolutionary a selection phenomenon because for whatever the reason was that they adopted that rule, it made the Christian world incredibly successful. Because it broke up the family ties and made so by breaking up the family ties, I mean Henrik's argument, and you've read the book, right? So I mean Henrik's argument is that this made the Catholic Church more powerful in some sense because instead of your allegiance going to the family, it went more to the group. Now, in terms of these taboos and stuff, yeah, it's incredibly interesting that you find, for example, pregnancy taboos about foods that you can't eat while you're pregnant. And it just so happens that many of these foods would be toxic for the baby. Well, they have no idea. They have no idea that this is going on, that this is happening. And I don't think there's anything magical going on here. I mean, I think this is largely, can largely be explained via cultural evolutionary processes by which people observe, they just copy what successful people do, right? So whatever, for whatever reason, right? Whether it was just luck of the draw, some people decided that they were going to not eat certain foods, right? during certain times, right? Well, if that ended up making that lineage of people more successful, right? Whether it's that person or their granddaughter or whatever, on average, those people are going to be copied. And so, in that way, these strange taboos can evolve, even if nobody has any conscious understanding of them. And another example that Henrik talks about is this example of food processing. So the specific example he uses manioc and people in the Amazon, and they go through this extremely complex process by which they detoxify this plant that they eat. And if you ask them why they do this, right, what they'll basically say is that, well, this is just how we do it, right? It's tradition or whatever, right? They ask them, it's not even clear that they understand that they're detoxifying it, right? They definitely don't have any chemical understanding of it, but it's a very complex process where they have to mix it with ash and, cook it at a certain temperature and all this. And those kinds of things it's very mysterious in some way how it could happen, but it's no more mysterious than how an eye could evolve through biological evolution, really. I mean, this was when I was younger, I was very skeptical about biological evolution for the same reason that many people are. It's like, how do we get something like as complex as an eye or complex as an ear? That makes no sense. But, these evolutionary processes I don't think our intuitions pick up on just how powerful they can be. This process of selection by which the more successful people or the more successful organisms or whatever are selected, and you get the shaping of whether it's cultural practices or biological phenomena, you get this very powerful shaping mechanism. So does that answer the question?
Yeah. I'm going to have one more question, and then I want to invite Ed to ask a few. I think this probably is covered under chaos, right? But you mentioned the human brain. Well, one of the reasons the human brain grew so dramatically is we discovered fire and we started cooking our food. And biologically speaking, that is a pretty good reason for why we got this part, right? And so I wonder, was that a when I think about complexity, I often think of random shocks to the system. And was the finding of fire just like, oh, look at that? Maybe if we put the rabbit in there, we'll get better outcomes. How much, in your view, is and now I'm speaking specifically about the chaos, right? How much of that is truly just random events that happened that we happen to notice, fire being the example I'm using here, and how much of that is actually us, as David Deutsch would say, humans are the only universal explainers and connectors. How much of that was also that early human, thank you, who said, hey, why don't we stick the rabbit in there? I mean, is it based on some observant human in this case, or just a random shot? What do you think, Brett? And Tom, I'd welcome your thoughts too, and then I'm going to throw it to Ed.
I think that way more than most people think is random. I think that way more evolves through systemic processes than is consciously designed than people tend to think. And this is true of things like the discovery of fire. Now, of course, I can't say for sure in that particular instance, but my sense is that many people tend to have this, at least an implicit belief that that humans design complex systems. And this is true in a very small subset of things, but like the legal system was not designed by anybody. It evolved, right? It evolved over many thousands of years. Even our political system, right? It was designed to some extent by the founding fathers, but the ideas that were inherent in that system, those ideas had evolved through trial and error over many thousands of years, right? So these systemic processes are way more powerful, and they result in way more outcomes than I think many people realize. And a lot less is due to conscious design. In fact, conscious design gets us into trouble quite often. The smart guy who says, why are we putting the manioc in ash? Right? This is idiotic. I want to, I think this is stupid, and I'm gonna do the smart thing, the rational thing. I'm gonna stop putting well, that guy gets poisoned, right? There's a very interesting example of this, talked about quite a bit in this literature, of these water temples in Bali, where they had a system of agriculture where they had a system of temples, and this is how they irrigated their water. So that it was regulated through this temple system, where the temples at the base of the river regulated the temples that were downstream of them, and there was a whole system of ritual and a whole system of mythology that went along with this. And this is how they'd done it for thousands of years. And it was not a system that was designed by anybody. It was a system that evolved from the bottom up. And in like the 1970s, these geniuses came along and said, this is all really stupid. We're going to implement, a scientific way of doing agriculture, right? A rational way of doing agriculture. And they stopped using the temple system. And within 10 years, the crops were infested by pests, and they were back to using the temple system within 10 years. And so these evolved systems, right? These systemically evolved systems often work in ways that we don't consciously understand them. They weren't designed by anybody. Another quick example is like, marriage, right? Monogamous marriage. Henrik argues that this has a function, right? It's a function that I would never have guessed. But what it basically does is it tames men, right? Because if you get a system, a culture with a lot of polygamy, what you get are a lot of leftover men who have no chance of getting married. And those men, so biologically, they tend to have higher testosterone levels because your testosterone goes down when you get married. But in terms of behavior, they tend basically what they do is they get together into roving bands, and they go around raping and pillaging. Well, a good way to stop, monogamous marriage means that there's fewer leftover men, and you get increased peace and cooperation within the society. And so that's one of these evolved systems that, it was probably taken up through trial and error, but the system, the cultures that adopted it thrived, and the ones that didn't got out competed. And so it's just another example of something that wasn't designed; it was evolved. And so that's basically.
Yeah, I'll just make a quick comment. I agree, but with what you just said about the evolution. And again, why do free markets work? Well, because they're complex adaptive systems where all of the new emerges. It's an emergent system, and it emerges from the bottom, not from the top. And then, of course, I think of Robert Oppenheimer's line, which is, of course, the world is going to hell. And the only way we can stop that from happening is to do absolutely nothing about it. So I think there's a lot in that line. Tom, do you want to jump in, and then we'll start leading
just
the question?
one single point, really, which is that, yes, but I feel that the stories that have real power reflect the underlying flow that Brett's talking about in terms of this propensity towards more integrated consciousness and positive sum games. That the two things I believe that are heretical is that there is a flow of things. There is an objectively good Tao, and you can align yourself with that typically by subjugating your ego to it. They're two very unfashionable ideas, but I think they're rather good. And I think if you look at modern morality tales like Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul and those kind of TV shows which really capture everyone's attention, it shows you that if you start paddling against that flow, your life is going to go to hell. And, that is sort of the objective proof that I have that this works, is if you do watch these people who are rowing in the right direction, their lives tend to go very, very well. And I think that is a message in a lot of the myths that, to use Brett's term, is more real than real, that not all of these evolutions are just random, that there is a direction of travel. And I think you neglect that at your peril.
Yeah. And obviously having read the Tao Te Ching since age 18, probably 2 to 3 times a year, every year since then, there is a great amount of wisdom that took this dummy until about age 50 to figure out what he was actually talking about. But you think of the good ruler, right? And the good ruler, as you mentioned earlier, Tom, the good ruler is the monarch who provides a safe environment for his people. And of course, the way it goes is, the worst kind of ruler is feared. The next is loved. But the best ruler of all rulers is the ruler who rules when something is accomplished and the people said, look what we did by ourselves, right? So totally in line with that. I agree with the Tao. The only quibble I would have there is the normal Taoistic interpretation of, we talked about morality earlier, right? So to the Tao, no, there is no good, there is no bad, there is flow, there is universal flow, and trying to insert more modern concepts of right and wrong to the Tao misses the theory of the Tao, the real Tao, the Tao that can't be named. Yeah. The Tao that can be named is the mother of a million things. And the Tao that cannot be named is the flow of this participatory universe that we live in. And I do agree, by the way, with your assertion that if you understand that flow, it's a bit like the simple way to put it is swim with the current. Don't swim against the current. The salmons are idiots, man. Just swim with the current and let it take you, and you immediately have far greater success, right? If we're going to have a swimming race and I choose to swim with the current and you choose to swim against it, I'm going to win. And so putting it back in human terms, I definitely think that you're correct in the assertion of, by understanding and being in this flow, the outcomes just are dramatically superior. And when people say, well, how'd you know that? Half of it is like, I always try to explain things as practically as possible, right? And so on the one hand, like pattern recognition, imbued intuition, it comes along when you've seen the same pattern so many times that you just know, okay, right? I've seen that one 50 times. I'm going to take advantage of that. But, the quant analytical side of me, I started noting every intuition I ever had and then rating it. Was I right? Was I wrong? And interestingly enough, I haven't been doing it. It's the sample size is too small, but for the most part, it's still hovering at about like 64% correct. But I think that there's also information in where I got it wrong. And so I want to, like, maybe 5 years from now, we'll do this again and we'll have a larger sample. Ed, we have not turned to you, and you are the guy who did all the brilliant research for it. So,
Well, I was just going to say, I think it's really interesting that Tom just brought up Breaking Bad, because literally that was the question I was about to ask, and I think I'm gonna ask it anyway, because it's sort of, I think I see it in a slightly different way to Tom. So the way, I mean, from my perspective, this sort of main sort of cultural storytelling trend of the last probably 10, 15 years, aside from superheroes, which is a whole different thing, is the anti-hero. And society loves the story of someone who just says fuck it and does increasingly evil things, basically. And we love it. I love Breaking Bad. Everyone loved Breaking Bad. The Boys on Amazon, Game of Thrones, all these different shows. And I think, Tom, you were saying you sort of saw the fact that it usually goes wrong for these people is sort of a reaffirmation of the hero's journey and of the metamyth. But I wonder whether the extent to which we as a society like those stories actually is a contradiction of it, and whether our society's relationship to these stories actually tells us something different about how we're relating to the hero's journey today.
So, or Brett,
go ahead, Tom. Yeah, if you have something.
No, you go, Brett.
Yeah. Well, I just wanted to say, in response to the question of whether it's contradicts the hero myth, my answer is no, I don't think so, because the hero myth is not the only story that we're attracted to, right? We love romantic stories, we love tragedies, we love comedies, but the hero myth is the story that became the central story of many of our great civilizations, right? Why did it become why was Marduk the central story of Babylon, right? Why was Horus the central story of Egypt? Why did Jesus Christ become the central story of our culture and the Buddha and so on? So the hero myth is not the only story we're attracted to, but it's the story that through these systemic evolutionary processes came to be the foundation for these great civilizations of the past. And so the question is, why that story? Well, I mean, the answer to that would just be that story is a story that we can, what Christians ask is, what would Jesus do? Right. Well, that is what you're supposed to ask about the hero, right? Like, it's a story. It's a pattern of behavior that we can aspire to, and it's abstract enough that everybody in the civilization can aspire to it. And so it provides a central sort of sacred narrative around which a civilization can focus. In terms of our attraction to the anti-hero and things like that, I mean, part of that is that, morality, I'm a big fan of Friedrich Nietzsche, and, Nietzsche says a lot of very provocative things. And one of the things he says is that, all morality is cowardice. Well, it's important to understand what he means by that. But, there is a sense to it in which people are attracted to these stories because they deep down really would love to do something like that, and they get to live that out in their fantasy because they can't do it in their real life, right? For whatever reason, because the consequences are too great. But the fact that, these stories do end up in death and destruction for everybody involved, it is an important lesson, because if you engage in zero-sum games, I think that is what happens, right? I think that's generally what happens, not always, right? There's not a happy ending to every real story, but yeah, I guess that's all I had to say about that.
I just want to jump in on the Breaking Bad, because as fate would have it, my wife and I just completed rewatching the entire series. And when you rewatch the entire series, you see, first off, I think Gilligan is a genius. I think that he's amazing in just so many ways. We'll put that aside. But there is, at the climax, we see Walter White's transformation into Heisenberg, right? And we see his increasingly evil actions, poisoning the child, watching the girlfriend of Jesse die without
the prison murders. Prison murders, which is brutal.
With the prison murders, which is like sort of this brilliant thing. But here's the thing that kind of brings it back to the idea of, this is a story that you don't want to do because it leads to death and destruction. At the end, Walter White, after Jesse gives him up and they're out in the desert and he orders Jesse to be killed, and then Hank comes along, his brother-in-law, and he won't kill family, kith and kin, right? That's back to maybe the idea of the blank slate, and that's a whole different story. But what happens is he tells them not to kill Jesse, or not to kill Hank and leave Jesse alone. But then they kill Hank, they kill his partner, they haul Jesse out from the car, and they say, "What do you want?" And Walter White says, "Kill him." Yeah. And then the kid says, wait, we might be able to get some information out of this. We can torture this guy and get some really good information. And Walter's pissed off by that, and like the uncle says to Walter, "You good with it? As long as we kill him after we get the info out of him, is that cool?" And Walter asserts that is cool. But at the end, the final episode, what happens? Walter, in a weird way, redeems himself. He redeems himself by knowing that he's going into a situation he will die in, but he redeems himself by saving Jesse. And it shouldn't surprise us that Jesse was the only one who was the most conflicted about what they were doing, and Jesse had a true or good heart. So really attracted to all of the mayhem that Walter, Sons of Anarchy, another one, same ending, right? The main character finally redeems himself, giving himself over to death to make things right. And so just an observation, Tom.
I want to tie this all together, right? Because I think you can. So Walt pursues power and becomes Heisenberg. In Better Call Saul, Jimmy McGill pursues power and becomes Saul Goodman, right? They literally change identity.
Right.
Why? Because they use their gifts, either chemistry or incredible loquaciousness, for evil or for material gains. And they gradually make cascadingly poor moral decisions, and it takes them so far off base that the only way they redeem themselves is by inverting those skills back towards the good. And they do achieve redemption. I'm not going to spoil the movie there, but the thing that you used to phrase there, and it's not going to surprise you, Jim, given the topic of our last podcast, but C.S. Lewis talked about men without chests, that you had this society where the rational was in charge of the spiritual, right? Where these left hemispheric skills were not being used in service of the right. And the way for us to reconcile everything was to return the left hemisphere into the service of the right. And the organ of that was actually the heart, right? And the heart is this, in my opinion, this organ of relevance realization that is tied to the Tao in this possibly very literal sense that allows us to, both individually and from a societal perspective, to realign with the good, because we hear all these stories about what happens when we go the other route.
Good observation. Ed.
So, I mean, one comment on that and then another question. So the other sort of spanner in the works in the Breaking Bad story is that Gus Fring is what his ultimate, he is sort of the archetypal pure rationalist character, and that is his superpower. But his downfall is his emotion, and it's only when he lets his emotion come into it that he falls. So I don't know how that interacts with what we were talking about, but a different question or going off myth is that, Tom, you write a lot about Slack and the importance of having Slack in the system. My understanding from Brett's work is that this emergence into new forms of complexity comes from tension, moments of tension. And to me, the concepts of Slack and tension are always diametrically opposed. So I'm just interested how they interact with each other in sort of wider theory.
That's a good question. Tom?
Yeah, I think Brett can probably handle this better, but I think Slack is room for exploration, right? So Slack is almost noise, right? So it's like, I've got this incredibly rigid structure, which is my 9 to 5. I'm going to pull that back 10% and inject noise, exploration, and that's going to allow me to experiment in the same way that psychedelics does to what Brett's saying. But sorry, Brett, you know.
Oh, that's very much along the lines of what I was going to say. So the tension is caused by competition, and that tension leads to specialization. It leads to this increased efficiency. And that is what you get when you have massive competition, right? Highly efficient, highly specialized systems. Now, the problem with efficient and specialized systems is that they're not very resilient. They don't change very well. Now, what happens eventually is that you get the tension leads to this descent into chaos, right? And it's that descent into chaos that is the slack. It's the slack that allows novelty to emerge. And so, if you have too much competition, right? So I'm all in favor of competition, right? But if you have a competition that's too intense, it doesn't give you the slack that is necessary for a certain amount of creativity, right? So we see this, for example, in Life Finds a Way. He talked about this in terms of Asian cultures, who the standardized testing in those cultures is extremely competitive. What you find is that these kids do very well on standardized tests, and they don't tend to have very much creative output at all, compared to, for example, American kids. That competition doesn't give you enough slack to allow for the exploration that is necessary for creativity. So competition is great, but too intense competition will not allow for the emergence of novelty. But yeah, so there is the tension is caused by competition, but that competition, the tension cashes out in a descent into chaos, and it's in that chaos is where you get the slack that allows for novelty to emerge. For example, this is like punctuated equilibrium in evolutionary theory. So evolution is not necessarily a fully gradual process. What we see are these periods where you get like the Cambrian explosion, where you get the emergence of massive amounts of novelty sort of all at once, right? Well, what they think happened in the Cambrian explosion, for example, is that you had the emergence of a new type of organism, which was a predator, basically. You had the emergence of a predator, one theory about what happened. And because of the emergence of the predator, right, it disrupted the whole system, right? So you had a sort of equilibrium state because there was all this competition, massive specialization. The emergence of this novel phenomenon caused this massive chaos, which allowed for the slack that allowed for the emergence of all these novel forms. And so I think that's kind of how I conceptualize the relationship.
Yeah, and I'm just remembering the Whitehead quote that all great ages were chaotic ages. I think if I'm getting that right. If my memory's wrong, correct me on that quote.
I don't remember that quote, but I haven't read all of Whitehead. So
yeah, okay. So I was taken by that comment that he made as I was reading him, and I'm like, that's right. And to kind of tie it into why we're so interested in having you brilliant guys on the show is we believe that we are in such a period right now. It's the whole concept of our series, The Great Reshuffle, whereby we believe that this period is going to become even more chaotic in terms of the novelty generation that occurs. And what we're seeing is the collapse of all of the old models. If we want to make it for our listeners who want like ideas for startups, well, start there. Because all of these old models that worked very, very well and over limited periods of history, that's another problem. Our recency bias blinds us to the fact that all of this has been done in a different form, albeit, but before. Really good to study history because it will give you a good idea about, what happens during chaotic periods. This concept, what's the Zen idea that when the student is ready, the teacher appears? And I have certainly seen in your work, Brett, and Tom, in some of the things that you've written, this is like 5 years ago, we probably wouldn't be talking about this not because we weren't interested, but because other people would say, these are a bunch of think boy word cells, and I don't want to pay attention to that shit.
I mean, they probably still are in my case, but yeah, thanks.
You're my favorite think boy word cell.
You probably say that.
You'll push it by.
Oh, listen, we are like, this could be one of those that goes like for God knows how many hours. But we want to make it listenable and have it make an impact. So I think that already I can, with just the notes I took here and reading Ed's notes, and reading your work directly, Brett, especially you, we gotta revisit this for kind of a second section, because as Tom knows, I love speculations. I love thinking about this stuff. I do try to have a practical bent, in terms of, I think that I launched an entire company because of thinking about this. And I think that now's the time. We're at the inflection point. This is going to become an increasingly chaotic era as we bring things like AI and its revelations into the mix, as that becomes normalized and it affects people's thinking, right? Because when you see insights that we humans weren't capable of making, we are capable of recognizing, wow, that's an amazingly good idea. Hadn't thought about that. On the schedule, we will put the four of us together again. Absolutely fascinating. I love that this is bleeding into just what I would call, normal folks. Over the last year, just people I would, and I don't mean this in a derogatory way at all, but people who, they're not into these types of speculations and whatnot, have increasingly come to me with questions that are very much directly addressed Brett, in your work, and Tom in your work as well. So I'm excited about that because as people who I would normally not think who would like want to really interrogate me about these types of ideas, when I see that happening, I think that's a really great thing. So thank you for this first part, which I've already deemed first part. And we'll set up a second one. I always end the show, as Tom knows, by and guess what, Ed? I didn't tell you I was going to do this, but I'm going to ask you too, even though you're
Sure.
part of the team. So I'm going to start with Brett, though. We always ask at the end if we made you that monarch, if we made you the ruler. We're going to make you the ruler of the entire world, though. You can't do anything violent. You can't compel people to do anything bad or re-education camps. But what you can do is speak into a magic microphone, and you're going to give me 2 ideas that you want to incept in all 8 billion of us here on Earth right now. And this is important. Whatever their morning comes, right? They're going to wake up and they're going to say, I just had 2 of the greatest ideas and I'm going to do both of those things. What 2 things, Brett, are you going to incept in the world?
What 2 things am I going to incept? Yeah, it's a very interesting question. I think the first one is that, and I actually believe this is one of those things that I tend to stay away from saying stuff like this because I don't like saying cheesy things, but I actually believe this. I actually believe that every time an individual gets their act together and sets forth on the path to becoming a competent and powerful individual, the world moves one step further from the brink and one step closer to something resembling paradise, potentially, right? And so do that, right? So that's the first thing I would say, is that in yourself and others, right? Become who you could be, right? And the second thing I would say is that who you are right now is not okay, because you could be way more than what you are. And I feel like this is something that is not, we talk too much about self-esteem in our culture and feeling good about yourself. And none of this has ever resonated with me personally. Okay. It's not that I don't feel good about myself. It's that, and it's not that I don't think people ought to feel somewhat good. It's that you could be way more than you are, and you should be. And what would happen if you took 5 years and you really put yourself together? What would you be like? Well, try it and find out. And I guarantee you things will get way better. Many people do that. Things will get way better for everybody. And I believe that. And so those are the 2 things I guess I would say if I was king and had a big moment.
I will second both of those inceptions. I agree with both of them. Ed, you didn't get a chance to think about this, did you?
I didn't.
No?
No, I wouldn't
Put
have
you on
planned
the
this.
spot. Give me 2 things
Yeah.
to incept.
Okay, 2 things. I think the first one would be find something you're passionate about and do it. Loads of people don't have passions, and like it doesn't have to be anything that has any sort of productive use or any meaning or anything. Just find something you love and then just do it, because like it just gives your life so much more meaning. So that's 1. And 2 is sort of related, but it's work out what you're stopping yourself from doing and then do it. So that everyone's stopping themselves from doing something that they feel like they should or they could, but there's always a reason they don't want to do it, and work out what that reason is and then do it.
I like both of those, and on the spot too. Now, Tom, you've had like several bites at this apple, but I bet you're going to have 2 more for me.
Yeah, but I didn't realize I was going to have to do it this episode, so I'm just as unprepared as everyone else. So I'm gonna piggyback. Which is I've noticed that the quality of people's lives is directly correlated to the amount of intelligence they put on things outside of their own brains, specifically, right? So that can be their hearts, that can be people around them, and that can be the whole world. And I think that if I could incept that idea, it'd be like, just assume that everything else is pretty damn intelligent and not just matter to be manipulated, and that it might actually be giving you signals to help you, which is, again, kind of a weird idea. And I think the second part of that, which I think both Ed and Brett have kind of intimated as well, is that like, that's going to require admitting your mistakes, and that's going to require a lot of pain, and that's going to require a lot of humility and redirection. But following your heart is absolutely delightful, and finding a way to submit your ego to that as hard as it is absolutely worth it. So they're two kind of related ideas, but saying the same thing.
Yeah, I love those. What a great series of inceptions. You know, Ed, I think we're probably going to have to put a book out of all of these inceptions. What do you think?
Yeah, let's do it. That's a great idea.
Well, first off, thank you both for such a fascinating conversation. We're definitely going to do part 2 because I'm fascinated by this, and I think we only really kind of scratched the surface as an introduction. So we will set that up. But for the meantime, thank you so much. And since, by the way, this airs the last week of December, Happy New Year! Happy 2023!
Happy New Year, guys. Happy New Year.
Thanks for having me, Jim. And thanks for recommending me, Tom.